Hello friends, welcome back to another episode of a video series in which we peel back the layers of some of our favorite Bible stories and reveal the mysteries that most people miss. Well, last time I introduced you to Joseph, the 11th and favored son of the patriarch Jacob. He doted on Joseph, not least of which because Joseph was the son of his favorite wife, Rachel. Joseph's brothers hate him, and the boys decide to do away with him, get rid of him altogether. They almost killed him, but cooler heads prevailed, and instead they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. We're going to continue with the story today, and we're going to talk about what happens to Joseph in Egypt, and what prepares him for becoming second in command of all of Egypt, and the inevitable confrontation with his 10 brothers. If you haven't had a chance to hear the first installment of this, Joseph chapter 1, then I encourage you to go back and do that now. And it should be in your upper right-hand corner right about now. My left, your right. Okay. Now, before we get into the rest of the Joseph story, I want to set the stage and give you some context here for some of the more interesting aspects of this story. This is one of the most complex and longest single stories in the Old Testament, certainly in Genesis. In fact, of all the patriarchs, Joseph, of all people, gets the most ink time, even above old Father Abraham, which is strange, right? Because Joseph doesn't have a tribe named after himself. That honor belongs to his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. They're 2 of the least famous tribes of Israel. I mean, who's heard of Ephraim and Manasseh, right? So what in the world is Joseph featured so prominently here at the end of this book, Genesis? Well, short answer is I don't know. But I will tell you that in terms of Israelite history, Joseph represents an end of an age, if you will, and the beginning of a new age. It's the moment in Israel's history when they go from being a family of patriarchs to an entire nation. And then you have the Exodus, that epic venture from Egypt into the Promised Land. So this Joseph story gets us there and gets Israel into Egypt. Another thing I want to do here is to recall the Tamar-Judah sequence. Now, as I said last time, if you're reading along in Genesis chapter 37 and you get to where Joseph is sold into slavery and dad is heartbroken because his sons have deceived him, you're getting ready to learn what happens to Joseph in Egypt, and all of a sudden it's interrupted by Judah and Tamar stuff. And you're thinking, what in the hell's going on? Well, it looks like a plain interruption, but it's not. It's put there for a particular purpose. Well, the Hebrew redactors, that is, those who sewed these stories together in the present form for us, were doing something rather clever with this story. All of the motifs and the imagery that's supposed to draw our mind to key points in the Joseph story is embedded and kind of summarized in the Judah-Tamar story. You have everything from the veil of deceit, right? Tamar dons the veil and deceives Judah, just as the coat deceives Jacob. And then you have the recognition. Here, do you recognize this? And then you have later the unveiling, the opening of the eyes, when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. I want you to understand something about the text that is often overlooked in your average sermon. And that's what the Hebrew writers and the redactors were doing in pulling these stories together. The Judah-Tamar story is very different from the rest of the Joseph story. In fact, they seem to read nothing alike. Joseph is not mentioned one time in Genesis chapter 38. It reads as if somebody else wrote it. And that's exactly what scholars think. They believe that these stories were very old, centuries old in fact, before they were actually written down and codified. And that when they were written down by different traditions and different guilds, a final group of redactors sewed them together for us. They decided which stories would go together, and then they did some editing, and they made this complete picture for us in a rather brilliant way, oftentimes. Now, a question you might be asking yourself right now is, hold on, Hoss, didn't Moses write Genesis? In fact, I thought Moses wrote the Pentateuch. That's the first 5 books of the Bible. Well, evidence is very much against that conclusion. The evidence is very much in favor of lots of different writers at different times in different traditions, and the stories were brought together for us in some rather unique and often creative ways. The Hebrew writers especially the redactors, they weren't simply engaged in reciting history for us. These guys were engaged in literature. They wanted us to read these as stories, to be engaged with the characters, to empathize with them. They wanted us to seek plausible motive for the characters, and to be surprised when things took turns that we don't expect. And they planted literary devices to lead our minds and to engage our heads with what's going on, like Judah's rod or Joseph's coat, that we're going to see repeated in this story in a really interesting way. So I want to plant that flag before we get into the rest of the text, starting with Genesis chapter 39. Let's see what happens to this young man in the bonds of Egyptian slavery. Well, he's sold to a man named Potiphar. Potiphar is the captain of the royal guard to Pharaoh. He's a pretty important guy, okay? And Joseph, it turns out, has undergone a startling transformation. He has shrugged off the mantle of brat prince and has become a man of considerable character and integrity. Now, Joseph's diligence and attention to detail gets him ultimately promoted to the head of Potiphar's household. Joseph has command of everything. Understand this. This means our young friend Joseph is literate. And not just literate, he can write too and do numbers. If he's keeping the books of Potiphar's house, he's quite skilled. Now, as a 17-year-old boy herding his father's sheep, it seems unlikely that he would have gotten such a sophisticated education to be able to pull off bookkeeper and manager of affairs in Potiphar's household. My best guess is that old Potiphar would have put him in an accelerated GED program, and that Joseph was quite precocious. Now, in my fanciful mind, I'm wondering how Joseph actually came to be in this position and how he was discovered. I imagine that Potiphar has a fairly large household with several slaves. I'm picturing Potiphar sitting in his study, looking at his huge and polished mahogany desk, and maybe he picks up the autographed baseball from Mickey Mantle or something like that. And when he picks it up, there's no dust ring underneath that thing. And all his books have been carefully polished individually and set back in their place. And he's thinking, by Jove, ever since we bought that Hebrew boy, my study has done nothing but shine. Say, what is that boy's name anyway? Is it Josiah? Is it Amos? Is it Elron? Now Potiphar's wife is sitting over there shining her nails, looking coquettishly bored, and she says, his name's Joseph. Joseph! Yes, that's the name, that's one. Yes, Joseph. Good lad, good solid form. Tight core, broad shoulders, trim waist. I bet that boy does his calisthenics every morning, just like I did in my barracks days. Yes, good posture, too. Never looks at his toes, always looks you in the eye. I can respect a man like that. He reminds me of me, you know. Honey, you don't see your toes, and it ain't because you have good posture. Oh, you know what, Nefertiti? I think we should promote Joseph to a more permanent status in this household, don't you? Something a little bit more involved. Oh, I think that's a great idea. So young Joseph is promoted, and he's the head of the household, and things are looking up for our young hero. But there's a dark cloud on the horizon, which you may already know and might have already guessed. Potiphar's wife is quite taken with this young Hebrew boy. She thinks he's a fine piece of man flesh. And so she rather boldly propositions Joseph. I'm imagining the scenario like this. Joseph, right? You know, I think my husband, Potiphar, he works you too hard. You need to relax, and I've got just the thing. What do you say you and I retire to the bedroom and get to know each other a little bit? Joseph is such a bean counter and so laser focused on his job, he might say something like, no thanks, I have plenty of work to do. I'm not tired. I think you're misunderstanding me. Let's go back to the bedroom. I'll give you a massage. Nope, I did my push-ups this morning and I always stretch. I make sure that I work out the ligaments with myofascia release. Now, if you please, carry on. Cutie pie, you're not hearing what I'm saying. I want you. That's a really bad idea. Why? I think that should be obvious. Do I really need to spell it out? Maybe you should. Potiphar has given me responsibility for everything in this household. I can do whatever I want. I can go wherever I want. He has given me everything but you, his wife. Far be it from me to commit such a terrible evil against my master Potiphar. There's nothing like something you can't have that makes you want it all the more. And Potiphar's wife hounds Joseph day after day, to the point where Joseph won't even be in the house alone, for fear that Potiphar's wife might find him and catch him unawares. And her seductions get more intense and more direct. And she grabs him by the coat and says, "Come on, boy, I'm not taking no for an answer for another minute. You and me are going to do it. Right here, right now. I don't care who sees." And Joseph shrugs out of his coat and runs. Well, she knows she's beat. She's just put on her best dance, and he had none of it. And hell hath no fury, if you know what I mean. And so she takes the coat and waits for the servants to come in and says, "Look at this coat. Do you recognize it? It belongs to that Hebrew boy who's come to try to make sport of me, but I screamed when he came on to me, and he run off." And then Potiphar comes back, and she's waiting for him with the same song and dance. Potiphar is angry. But I can just see him saying, "Oh, dear God, Nefertiti, not again! Woman, how many times have I told you to keep your libidinous escapades private? I cannot afford another scandal. I'm going to have to deal with this. Oh, Joseph was my best servant. Damn you, woman." And so Joseph is thrown into prison. Now, it's interesting, isn't it, that Potiphar didn't just kill Joseph outright if he believed he'd actually assaulted his wife? It makes you wonder, again, not to read too much into the text here, if perhaps Potiphar might have not believed his wife. Well, the royal prison may not have been exactly comfortable, but maybe Potiphar felt that he could preserve his reputation and preserve Joseph's life at the same time. Well, be that as it may, Joseph winds up in prison. He's again at a low point. But his diligence, his attention to detail, and his bootstrapping abilities serve him well in prison. God is with him, and he soon is put in charge of the prison by the warden. Now that's interesting. You wonder how, once again, that happens, right? The practicalities, and it's good to empathize with the characters. I don't know what Joseph would have done. I mean, does he go from prison to prison and say, "Okay, boys, chop, chop, up and at 'em. It's a beautiful day to be out underneath these Theban skies. There's bricks to make, arts and crafts today, kids. We're gonna make pyramids." I don't know. And scriptures don't tell us what exactly Joseph did. If perhaps one day the warden's sitting there tallying his books and he's trying to keep the numbers straight, he's going, "Oh, great. I've done it again. If Pharaoh hears about this again, he'll have my head. I've lost another prisoner. Hey, prisoner number 118, are you in here? Oh, I don't think we have prisoner 118. Maybe I've miscounted." Joseph standing over there saying something to the effect of, "Excuse me, I can do numbers." "Who are you? Hey, wait a minute. I know you. You're Ramoshay, aren't you?" He prefers Ramoshay, first of all, and he's block 3 at the end of the hall. "I'm Joseph. Maybe you'd better let me take a look at your books, because your columns are as crooked as your teeth." So Joseph spends a little time in the ledger and gets things straightened out. "Look, you're not missing any prisoners. You've just miscounted. Listen, you really ought to move to the Arabic number system. Even though it hasn't been invented yet, it's really effective." "Hey, you're pretty good at this. I got an idea. Why don't you take this over full time?" "Oh, that sounds great. Yay me." "Hey, I'll work out a deal for you. No more back-breaking brick making. Just for you. Inside doing the books, everybody else is out doing bricks. What do you say?" "Hey, that sounds great. I'm in." Joseph's in prison for some time. We don't know how long. And then one day, a couple of dignitaries from Pharaoh's own court comes into Joseph's custody. It's the cupbearer, sometimes known as the butler. He's the guy who makes sure Pharaoh's drink isn't poisoned or food isn't poisoned. And then there's the baker, not to be confused with the candlestick maker and blah, blah, blah. Ha ha, you didn't see that coming. Anyway, now we don't know why they're in prison. Some scholars or exegetes suggest perhaps that they're in there because of a suspected coup, and they're being held until Pharaoh figures it out. Again, prison time is an unusual punishment for this day and age. You won't find prison time anywhere in the Mosaical law for malfeasance or miscreancy. Is that a word? Miscreancy? I don't know. Crimes against God, let's say. Law systems popular in those days, like lex talionis, eye for an eye, more commonly favored the more physical punishments, leading all the way up, and usually, death. So, these guys might actually be in a holding cell until things are figured out, jail. But they're under Joseph's custody. Joseph says, on behalf of Pharaoh and the warden, I want to welcome you to this orientation of Pharaoh's prison. Let's see some ground rules, no shenanigans, no trying to escape, no climbing the walls, and you'll be given 3 sheets of double-ply toilet paper at the first of each week. Use it wisely, because once it's gone, it's gone. And there's no hoarding allowed, so it'll be confiscated if we catch you hoarding. Now, debits for food and toiletries will be taken out of your family's account, no less than 20 sesterces per month. Now, a couple of things about sharing cells. There will be 5 men to a cell, and this goes on and on. I don't know. Once again, I'm speculating. This is not in the scriptures. 20 what? Wait a minute. Sesterces? Ain't that a Roman coin or something? And he's going to charge us for toilet paper? Be quiet. I'm trying to hear. Did he say something about safe soap retrieval in the showers? Okay. So these 2 individuals, the cupbearer and the baker, are in prison for some time. And one day they're looking a little down. They both have dreams on the same night, right? And Joseph is coming by the prison. Come on, wake up, sleepyheads, it's time to go. And he sees the cupbearer and the baker looking down in the mouth. And he says, cheer up, boys, let's not look so lugubrious. What's the matter? And the cupbearer says, man, we both had dreams. Ain't nobody around to interpret them for us. And Joseph, being the can-do man that he is, he says, all dreams belong to the Lord. Come on, gimme, let's hear. And so the cupbearer says, I was outside and I saw this vine growing up out of the ground. And then pop, 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 out come these 3 branches. And there's grapes growing out of them. One in this big old cluster, hanging down from one of the branches. And I grabbed hold of it, and I squeeze it right in the cup, and I hand it off to Pharaoh. What do you suppose that means? Oh, that's easy. 3 branches on the vine is 3 days. In 3 days' time, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your old position, and you will put the cup in Pharaoh's hand like you always did. That's great. Oh, man, that's awesome news, Hoss. Thanks. Now, what can I do for you? Well, I was taken from the land of the Hebrews forcibly. That's against my will. And it was not fair that I was thrown into this prison so unjustly. When you see Pharaoh, you remember me and let him know what I did for you. So the baker hears this and he's like, oh dear, that sounds excellent. Say, I had a dream as well. Come on, let's hear. I was baking as usual, and I had baskets on my head, 3 of them. And they were full of all kinds of baked goods, the finest ingredients. I only use the finest ingredients, make everything from scratch. I had them on my head, and the birds were eating out of them. Strange. Okay, here's what the dream means. In 3 days' time, yes, Pharaoh is going to take off your head and hang you. And the birds will eat off your flesh. By the way, hanging in those days wasn't the Old West style where they just strung you up by a rope. Hanging meant impaling on a gibbet. Very unpleasant way to go. I hope what Joseph said was perfectly accurate, that they took off his head first. Anyway, bad news for poor old Baker. Let's pause here and examine a little bit of the story and the statement that Joseph made to the cupbearer. I was taken forcibly from the land of the Hebrews, he said. Now let's look at the word Hebrew for a minute, because that's an interesting word. Now, the origin of the word Hebrew is very strange and mysterious to scholars. They don't know quite where it comes from and how to etymologize it. What the etymology is? Where the origins of the word for Hebrew is. Throughout Scripture, it's most often understood as referring to the children of Abraham, right? Especially by strangers, by other nations. If that's the people of Abraham, we know that Abraham is not yet many nations. I mean, there are the Ishmaelites, right? And then there's the sons of Jacob. And Isaac, the father of Jacob, hasn't had many children. So it makes you wonder what he's referring to. Is he referring to his own family, as if his family and the children of Abraham would at this time be familiar to the Egyptians? Or is he referring to someone else, or to people of a same language root? Remember, Abraham came from Ur. That's way over to the east, okay? This could be a little show of when this was written. That this was written at a later time, when the Hebrews were well known and understood as Hebrews throughout the nations. I don't know, but it is an interesting phrase for Joseph to use here. Now the second thing is also interesting, and this was definitely purposeful by the Hebrew redactors. Joseph uses a very strange word here for prison. He uses the word bor, which is the same word used to describe the cistern or well into which he was thrown by his brothers. He says, "It was unfair for me to be thrown into this well," or cistern, he literally says. So this is once again a retrospective of Joseph's original state, being thrown in the well. He's in the well once again. This is the storyteller's way of focusing our attention. It's a low point once again for Joseph. Where do we go from here? Now, we've seen the coat of many colors dipped in blood. Here, do you recognize this? We've seen Judah's rod. Here, do you recognize this? And then we've seen Joseph's cloak. Potiphar's wife. Here, do you recognize this? So we see these motifs repeated. And we even see the word cistern repeated. So this story is cyclical. We're being brought back around again to reflect on where we've already been, wondering, where the heck are we going? What's going to happen to Joseph now that he's been thrown into the well again? Well, you're going to have to wait and find out about that next time. When Joseph will go before Pharaoh, Joseph will interpret a couple of dreams, he will become viceroy of Egypt, and he will confront his brothers, who will fail to recognize him, much as Judah failed to recognize Tamar. So, if you found this video worth your time, then by all means hit the like button, leave a comment, tell me what you think about the literary devices I've pointed out and how they were used in the story. Tell me if you disagree with any of this. Tell me if you have any other insights that I might have missed. I'm not a Bible scholar. This is just me reading and studying and trying to figure things out. And I'm learning too. So thank you again for joining me. I hope to see you next time. And Lord willing, see you in the next video.